There was a student who was just starting college. He had finished up in high school, and he had great grades in high school. He'd worked really hard and had studied really hard so that he could get those great grades. He thought he knew how to study well. This is the time of year right now, isn't it, that people are heading back to college, and so we're really familiar with this kind of setting. You see, he was going into his freshman year in college, and as he was taking courses, it was about midway through the semester, and he realized that the old way that he had studied and learned and the books that he had read, it wasn't going to work anymore. You know, he had to change the way that he studied, but he didn't really realize this until too late. There was a class, a particular week where he had multiple tests and papers and books he had to read. In all of his different classes, they were all due on Friday of that week. So he'd been working really hard to get everything done. I've been there before myself. I know how that feels when you've got a bunch of homework or assignments. Anybody ever had a bunch of things they had to get done on one day, whether it was in school or work or whatever? You just feel like, oh my goodness, I don't know how I'm going to get all this done. So he's working really hard, and this might have happened to you, but he forgot something. Like one thing slipped through the cracks. You ever done that when something slips through the cracks and all of a sudden you have that moment where your eyes are like, oh no. You know, you remember that thing that you forgot. And this is what happened to him. He walked into his class and he sat down, and the professor started handing out packets of paper to everybody, and he was like, what in the world is this? And he got his packet of paper, and it said midterm exam right on the top of the paper. And he did not know he had a midterm in that course that day. He had not studied. Now he had been preparing for, doing all of his other homework assignments and things like that in the class. So he thought, maybe I'll do all right. Maybe I'll do all right. I've been reading in the books and, all the quizzes. I took all the quizzes, but this is the big boy, the test, So he sat down, he started taking the test, and as he's working through all of the questions, he keeps looking up at the clock and realizing, oh boy, I've got 20 minutes left. Now I've got 15 minutes left. And he realizes he has 10 minutes left, and he has like about half of the test to go still. He was taking so long because he had to think about every answer so specifically. So he started filling them out as quick as he could. And the professor eventually said, all right, put your pencils down, stand up, bring your tests to the front. And he looked around and saw there were about 50 people in his class and was thinking, I should probably have about 10 more minutes, maybe 5 more minutes before they all get their tests turned in. So he kept working as hard as he could. And finally the last person turned theirs in, and he's still sitting there working on his test. And the professor looks up and says, young man, I told you to put your pencil down and turn it in. Now this is very unfair. You've gotten more time to work on your tests than all the other students have. And the student said, sir, I really need just another minute and I can finish this up. And he said, well, the whole time he's still filling out answers. Finally, he fills out the last question while he's talking to the professor. And the professor says, young man, I told you to put your pencil down and you're still working. Now, none of the other students had the same amount of time that you've had, so I'm gonna have to tell you that I'm gonna give you a 0 on this test. He's thinking, oh boy, here we go. I'm not gonna recover from that. But then he had an idea, the student did. He stood up with his test in hand and he walked to the front of the class, had all of his books with him, and he said, Professor, do you know who I am? And the professor looks at him, and I don't know if has anyone ever asked you that, do you know who I am? If they've asked you that question like that, boy, nothing will get you more mad faster than that question, Do you know who I am? And the professor he stood up, puffed out his chest, and he said, son, I don't care if you are the son of the President of the United States. I don't care who you think you are. You don't mean anything to me. I don't even know your name, and quite frankly, I don't even care. I have gotten 3 doctorates. I have taught in higher education for 25 years, and no one has ever said something like this to me. And the student once again said, sir, do you know who I am? And the professor just looked at him, just staring a hole straight through him. And the professor said, no, and I don't care. And the student picked up the stack of tests, slipped his right into the middle of the stack, and said, well, then I guess it doesn't matter, does it? And he walked out of the course, walked out of the classroom. Turns out he ended up getting, just barely a passing grade on the test and managed to make it out of the semester alive. It's funny. It's funny that sometimes we start to blend in with our surroundings. He was trying to blend in as best as he could so that the professor didn't realize who he was, right? And in these big classes, anybody ever been in a big class like that before? In these big classes, the professors don't know who you are. The same thing is true in life. Sometimes we tend to blend in. Anybody ever feel like they're invisible in this world? Sometimes I feel that way, where you just like, nobody knows me from anybody. And we're talking in the next couple of weeks about the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel is a really interesting person. He is from a lower class of the priestly tribe of the Levites. Okay, so if you remember your history, the tribes of Israel, you remember the Levites were known as the priestly tribe. They would be the religious rulers and leaders among the people there. And there was a lower class, and they were kind of the helpers. Maybe they'd pass the offering plates or do different things like that. In our context, obviously, it was different for them. But they were kind of the helpers. The Levites were the leaders. They were the helpers, the assistants, so to speak. And Ezekiel was one of these men. And this is in a time in the history of the people of Israel, the Hebrew people, that some really interesting things were happening. All throughout the Old Testament, you see a cyclical pattern, a cycle of exile and jubilation. Let me explain what that means. The people of God have a short memory. Okay? Let's boil it down to that. The people of God have a short memory. Meaning that one time they're praising God in one moment, things are going well, and when they're praising God, they're also spending time, in prayer and study, getting and growing closer to Him. So they get closer to God, right? If God's up here, right, and we're down here, they get, closer to God in their relationship with Him because they're praising Him, they're going to church, they're worshiping His name, they're reading their Bibles, they're doing all these things. That's in our context. In their context, their own things. They get close to God, and while they're up here close to God, things are going pretty good in their lives. They start to grow fat. I don't mean like physically overweight. What I mean is like they grow lazy in their relationship with God. Okay? They grow lazy because things are relatively good. Okay? Things are relatively comfortable in their lives. And so they kind of back away from doing all the things that they know they ought to be doing to continue to be closer to God. They don't pray as much. They don't worship Him as much. Maybe they're not attending temple and all the gatherings as much. And what happens is they still feel close to God because they still, in their minds, love God, but they're not actually doing the things that it takes to continue to be closer to Him. And so they're in this moment where they're close to God, but then they kind of start to come around here. And they're slowly moving away from Him because they're not really spending the time investing in their relationship with God like they should be. And what happens in this moment is they start to look around at the culture around them, and they start to be enticed by the culture around them. Meaning because they're not close to God anymore, because they're not spending their time focusing on Him and building up their relationship with Him, instead what they are doing is they are seeking for fulfillment in the world around them. It's really well known throughout the Old Testament that the people of God, what they would do is God would command them to do a certain thing. They'd do it for a while, and then they'd kind of slip and not do it as much. Right? I don't know if you've ever made one of these commitments in your life where you said, I'm going to be better at X, Y, and Z, whatever it might be. Elise and I got married. Elise is a very orderly and clean person. She picks things up. Whenever we would have friends that we were hanging out with, if we were out at dinner and we decided we wanted to go back to someone's house, they all knew we could come back to our house because it was always going to be picked up. Now, I'm not saying it's spotless, but it's usually picked up. She's very clean. I'm not, okay? I'm the kind of person that I'll take my shoe off and kick it that way. I'll take this shoe off and kick it that way. I'll take a jacket off and set it over the arm of the chair and just keep going, I'm not messy. It's not like I'm throwing garbage everywhere, but I just kind of set things down wherever I happen to set them down at. Anybody like that? Yeah? I think more people are like that than the other way. And when we got married, she kept saying, Cam, you got to pick up your stuff. You got to pick up your stuff. And I would make a commitment to her. I'd say, I promise I'm going to do a better job. When I take my shoes off, I'm going to put them right in the closet. When I take my coat off, I'm going to hang it up on the hanger. And I would do, pretty good for a week or two. And then I'd get lazy or I'd get tired or I'd, just want to come home from a long day and just kind of, boom, plop down on the couch and kick the shoes off. You know what I mean? You get a glass of water or whatever and just set it there on the table and then get up and walk away and it sits there for 2 days, And she'll be like, Cam, I thought you said you were going to be better. Oh, I told you I was going to be better. It's the same thing with like working out. You say, oh, I'm going to make a commitment. I'm going to work out 3 times a week. And then, you do maybe for like 2 weeks and then you don't anymore, right? We talked about this on Wednesday night in the adult gathering, how January is the time more gym memberships are made in January than any other time of the year. Also, more gym memberships are abandoned in January than any other time of the year because people make a resolution that they're going to work out more often, right? When we make commitments to things, we hold to it for a while, and then we kind of get comfortable. Maybe we get a little bit lazy, and we don't continue to do the things that we promised we were going to do. The same thing is true in the relationship with God, in our relationship with God, but specifically we're looking at the Hebrew people and their relationship with God. You can see this pattern over and over again. What happens is they're far from God, but then they start worshiping Him and trusting in Him. They get close to Him, and then they get comfortable. Their life is going relatively okay, and they start to move away from God again until they get down here, right? They're far from God. Maybe they have a remembrance of Him. They remember worshiping Him. They say, oh yeah, I'm a Christian. Or, well, we would say, I'm a Christian, but I don't really attend church that regularly. They might say, oh yeah, I'm part of the Jewish tribes, right? I'm not really super committed to it. And they're maybe down here. And then something difficult and challenging happens in their life. If something bad happens, and it's through that bad situation that the Lord then uses it to draw them closer to Him. Okay? So it's this cycle where they're far from God, and they start worshiping and trusting in Him as a result of the bad thing that they experienced. So they get a little bit closer to God, but then they start to see the things in their culture. They start to engage in their culture more, live in their culture more, and they kind of move away from Him. But then they're down here. Something bad happens, and they get drawn back closer to God again. Do we understand this pattern, how this works? Scott Daniels, who is a great preacher in the Church of the Nazarene and out in the Northwest at Northwest Nazarene University, he wrote a book called Exile. It's all about the cyclical pattern, the cycle of exile in the people of God. And he compared it to our own lives, that we do the same things in our own relationship with God, where we want to be close to God, but we're also kind of engaging in our culture. We're over here, we're doing the things that we want to do, but we also feel a little bit close to God. Maybe something bad happens in our life. We feel far away from Him. And then through that bad thing, we realize how much we actually need to depend on God. So we're drawn a little bit closer to Him through prayer, attending church regularly. We get close to God, and then we get a little bit too comfortable, and we start to move away from Him again. It's this pattern. Cycles of commitment. One moment you're committed, and then you get comfortable and you're not anymore. And it takes something bad to happen before you are committed again. Ezekiel is a really interesting book because God called him to be a prophet, to teach and preach to His people in one of these moments where they are very far from God. What had happened was earlier in the people, you might remember in their history, the people had clamored for a king. They wanted there to be a king to serve them as the kingdom of Israel. God said, look, if you get a king, it's just going to mean you're going to have things like wars and, all of the things, the bad things that come along with kings. But they said, no, we want a king. So God said, all right, I'll give you a king. If I just give you a really brief history of the people of God here, we know that took them in a really bad direction. They ended up splitting. There were 2 kingdoms now, and one was Judah, one was the northern kingdom of Israel. And we know that a number of different things happened. There were good kings, there were bad kings. It's in one of these periods around 650 BC, 650 before Christ, that an interesting thing happened. There was a king named Josiah. And he was kind of an old school kind of Jewish leader. And he wanted to kind of resurrect the old ways of following Yahweh, of following God. So he found, and he had some of these temples excavated and things like that, and found what's known as the Pentateuch. Penta meaning 5, all right? And what we would know as the Deuteronomical scrolls. I'm throwing out a lot of history, so if you're not a history person right now, you're probably glazing over a little bit. But stick with me because this is all important. All right? Around the year 630, they discovered these Deuteronomical scrolls that are the first 5 books of our Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And we know that those books, in fact, we did a whole sermon series on the story of Abraham out of these books not that long ago here at our church. They tell the history of God's people, and they also give very clear commandments, rules, and laws of how they should live to continue to follow God. So when Josiah found these books, there was like rioting in the streets. They mourned the fact that they had been separated from God, because when they found the books that talked about who God was and how he had provided for them, they were so blown away by how far they were from him. You ever had a moment in your life like that when you felt like you were far from God, and then he gave you some great promise and you remembered, oh wow, this is how great God is. How could I ever have been far from him? Why would I ever have turned my back on my relationship with God? He's so great. It's like they realized their history. But it was just a few years later that they began to grow comfortable again. It's just a few years later that what happened that we know as exile. You see, during this time, Israel was what's called a vassal state of the kingdom of Assyria. Assyria would be like in our common Iraq, Iran, that area. It was a great kingdom. Israel is right here, Assyria is over here, and Egypt is over here. Egypt and Assyria are two of the greatest world powers at this time, and they're right in the middle. They're right in the middle. What happened is Assyria eventually got taken over by Babylon. You remember the kingdom, the king's name, Nebuchadnezzar. We might remember that name. That's Babylon. They were an evil empire that was far from God. Assyria was taken over by Babylon. And eventually Babylon took over Jerusalem and Judea, Israel. I share all of this because God foretold all of this through his prophet Ezekiel. Now, I didn't put anything on our Bible app for today because we're actually looking at basically the first 16 chapters of the book of Ezekiel in this message today. So I could have put all of that in there, but you would have had to skim through 16 chapters of Ezekiel. You see, God calls Ezekiel in a really interesting way. If you want to look in Ezekiel chapter 1, you can flip there with me. There's some really interesting things that happen. In the very first part of this book, God gives Ezekiel this crazy vision, all right? This incredible vision. It says this: I looked and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north. This is a vision, not a dream. He's not asleep, but a vision that he sees. This is an immense cloud with flashing lightning surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal, and in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In their appearance, their form was human, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight. Their feet were like those of a calf and gleamed like burnished bronze. Under the wings of their 4 sides, they had human hands. All 4 of them had faces and wings, and the wings of one touched the wings of another, and each one went straight ahead. They did not turn as they moved. It's kind of crazy, right? I mean, it sounds like monsters that we're explaining here, right, that he's seeing. The whole gist of this vision, and you can look all the way through chapter 1 and even into chapter 2, this vision continues to go on and on. The whole point of the vision is this: that Jesus, that the Lord, that God cared about the people of Israel. If you go into detail on what all of these different creatures mean, and the wings and the wheels and all of this, the long and short of it is this: that God was still with his people even though they had turned their back on him. You might remember the wheels of Ezekiel. You ever heard of this before? The wheels of Ezekiel are talked about in Ezekiel chapter 1. It explains the wheels as a wheel that goes this way, right, that rolls like our car, but also has a wheel that goes this way. They're all combined in one, right? It's like the best spinning rims you could ever see, you know what I mean? It said they had eyes all over them. The point is that these wheels could turn in any direction that the Spirit led. And what Ezekiel is being given here in the vision is saying that God would go with his people wherever they might be. Okay? In fact, if you look later on in Ezekiel chapter 5, God says through Ezekiel, I'm going to scatter your peoples, but once I scatter them, do not lose heart, because I will gather you back together. He's saying, wherever you go, I will be there with you, and I will gather you back together at some point. Now, I may be losing a few of you because this is all some really deep, interesting things, You know, when the Lord started knocking on my heart to start a series in Ezekiel, I was like, okay, Lord. I'm not really sure why. I'm not sure how I'm going to preach a sermon on Ezekiel chapter 1, where we're talking about all these crazy visions and angels and cherubs and clouds and the center of the storm looking like glowing metal. I mean, that's all cool and all, but I don't know how then we come down and pray at the altar or something about that at the end of the service. It's really hard to know. Here's the point, church, and this is why I wanted us to look at this, because the people of God were in a moment where they had been far from him, and then Josiah discovered the scrolls, right? And they came closer to God, but then they started to turn their eyes away from him yet again. God says in Ezekiel chapter 5 through his prophet, let me read this for you. He says, "This is what the sovereign Lord says. This is Jerusalem, which I have set in the center of the nations, with all countries all around her. Yet in her wickedness she has rebelled against my laws and decrees more than the nations and countries around her. She has rejected my laws and has not followed my decrees." You see, all throughout the Old Testament, God gives the people the command not to intermix with the culture around them. He says, look, you have certain beliefs and understandings. And if you intermix, if you intermarry with the cultures around you, then those beliefs will be watered down. Let me really clearly say that this is not speaking to interracial relationships in our own world and our own culture. What this is speaking to is the fact that you should not be in relationship with someone who does not share the same beliefs that you have. Now, this is not the point of what I'm preaching today. This is not the whole point of this message, but let me really clearly say the same thing is true for us today, isn't it? That we should not be in relationships. We could be friends with people, but we should not enter into romantic relationships with people who do not believe in God. And here's the reason why, because we're going to face hardship as a result. Now, if you're in one of these relationships, I'm going to allow the Lord to speak into your heart on this. I'm not going to tell you anything about what you should do in that relationship. However, what I am saying is that in these relationships, and this is why the Lord is saying, it's not some kind of closed-minded, old-school way of thinking. What he is understanding is that these people are going to face trials as a result of this. That true belief in God is going to be watered down as a result of this. And he gives them the command not to intermix with the culture around them. And yet what we see over and over and over again is the fact that they're intermixing with the culture around them. God says in Ezekiel 5, "Jerusalem I've placed right in the center of many nations." Why might he have done that? So they might have been a lighthouse to those other nations, but instead of spreading the message of holiness and the love of God to all of these different people, instead what they did is they began to look more and more like the culture around them. They began to adopt the ways of thinking, the things that were important to the culture, instead of what was important to God. Does that happen in our world? What do you think? Yeah? We look around and we see the things that are important to our world and they become important to us as well. You see, what we find out as we continue to read through Ezekiel is that God allowed his people to go into exile. What that means is this, that in this time that they were far from him, God allowed the kingdom of Babylon to come and take them out of the place that they were and take them to a new country. Now, we really can't understand that. We live in America, right? It's like huge. We spend way more on military than any other country on the planet. So us getting taken over is really hard to imagine. But let's just imagine that one day Canada got all tough and decided to try and take us over. I know, it's funny. They wanted us to drink Tim Hortons coffee, and watch hockey and say A at the end of every sentence. I don't know, okay? I don't know. They just decided they wanted to take over America, and somehow they had the ability to do so. All right? Well, let me get it better. Maybe some country like China or North Korea or something like that, okay? But this is their neighboring country. And in our world, we don't have a neighboring country that really could take us over, okay? Or any country that probably could. But let's imagine that could happen. And they came into our country. They came to Roanoke, and they took basically 2/3 of everybody that lived here and ripped them out of their homes, and ripped them away from their families, and took them to another country where they spoke a different language, they had different cultural beliefs, they had different values morally and culturally, and they didn't believe in the same gods. This is what has happened. God says in Ezekiel 5 that this has happened as a result of your unfaithfulness to me. You see, what happened in the people of Israel while they were living in Jerusalem, they were looking at the culture around them, beginning to adopt the practices, the values, the morals of the culture around them. And as a result, God allowed them to be taken out of that land that he had given them and taken away to a new place. Now, he doesn't go so far to say that this is your punishment, but what he does say is this is what I have allowed to happen to you as a result of your unfaithfulness to me. And so here's what I want us to think about today, church. God does not do things to us, okay, to make us hurt or to go through pain. We had all these prayer requests we were talking about earlier. But sometimes when trials or temptations or difficulties come in our lives, he is going to use those things to draw us closer to him. If you are not close to God, if you're not in relationship with God, why would he block these bad things from your life? That might be the only way that he can convince you to come back to him. Now, let me ask you this. Do you think that you're the kind of person who looks around at your culture and thinks that those things are all beautiful and great and you get drawn to them? I like to think that I'm not. I brought a few things with me today. Bear with me. I had to set them over here because I didn't want to give away all the surprises that I was gonna do today. This is my fishing pole. I haven't used it yet since we moved here, but it's a good fishing pole. I like it. And I put on it today a $20 bill. Someone asked me, how come not 100? And I said, well, I don't have $100. You know, I used to go fishing a lot. I grew up there was a little retention pond in the back, basically in my backyard. We didn't own the pond, but there was a little pond there, and they had done some work, and a bunch of mud had come into the pond, and it killed all the fish. It was really sad. But what they did is they ended up restocking the pond. They put 100 catfish in this pond. It was crazy. In a couple of years, these catfish were huge. We used to go to Sam's Club and buy the cheapest bag of dog food we could find, and we'd go out and we'd throw this dog food out into the pond, and the catfish would come up. How you like that? Catfish eating dog food. We used to do that, and these catfish, they would get up on the surface of the water. They just open their mouths and they just vacuuming the top of the water. They got huge. These were big old catfish. We'd reel them in every once in a while, and the dog would just lose his mind, barking like wanting to attack this thing. But they were big catfish. What was crazy is they got used to the sound of when the dog food hit the water, you throw it. They got used to that, and as soon as they heard that sound, they'd come flocking to that corner of the pond. What's funny is, as a middle school boy, I was oh, this is like shooting fish in a barrel, almost literally. I would get my fishing pole, and sometimes I'd even put a piece of dog food on the hook, and you could literally just dunk it right in front of their face, and all of a sudden you've got a huge catfish on the end of your line. It was pretty fun. I mean, it was really easy to catch awesome fish. It kind of spoils you for real fishing, but it was really fun. You practice getting these big fish. This is the same thing, though, that happens in our lives as Christians. You see, Satan uses the things that look good in our culture to dangle them in front of our faces. It's when we're closest to God that he does this. Right? It's when we're closest to God that he wants to distract us and pull us away from him. So he'll dangle things in front of our faces that look good. See? Okay, Diana, here you go. All right? Ooh, okay, yeah. Here's the thing about catching a fish. You know that the fish might come up and might nibble a little bit, right? And you can see the end of your pole. Or I've had a bobber on here. You can see the bobber just, a little bit. They haven't really latched on yet. Maybe they're just, nibbling at the corner, right? But then when they get that hook, what happens is, you pull back, you get that fish. I think I just tingled my line, but you hook that fish, and if you've set that hook just right, it's not going to get away from you. You see, that's what happens in our life. Right when we are close to God, that's when Satan wants to distract us the most. And here's what happens. After we get close to God, we feel so great sometimes, and we're coming to church, but we get a little bit, lazy in our lives. It's just like starting a diet or working out. You'll be really good about reading your Bible, praying every day for a while, but then you kind of, get out of the habit, you get out of the habit, and all of a sudden Satan's going to start dangling things in front of your face. And so he's going to dangle these things, and they're going to seem attractive to you. $20, you know. Imagine, Gary, if this was $100, you might snatch it and run out the back door. Yeah, he'd be gone, he says. You're buying lunch, all right? You know, he'll dangle this in front of your face, and money is a big thing for our culture, right? I mean, who couldn't use more money? He'll dangle it in front of our face, and what happens if it's money, you know, you'll say, okay, I need to work harder, and maybe I'll skip church every once in a while so I can work, you know. I'm going to work late tonight, and that means I'm probably not going to have time to spend talking to the Lord or in prayer or reading my Bible at all. So you get too busy, and what happens is it just continues that cycle, you know, where you're close to God, but then you kind of grow away from him. And just like the Israelite people, you start looking around at the things in your culture that seem enticing, and you start seeking after those things instead of the Lord. You see, when your time is spent seeking after God, that's what you're going to be seeking after. But if you're not spending your time seeking after God, you're going to be spending your time seeking after other things. It might be money. I have a few other examples I brought with me today, too. It might be money for you. It might be a million other things. I don't have this many fishing poles, so I had to come up with another creative idea. I got an umbrella. This poor umbrella is about to give up the ghost right now. You know, I got a cell phone on here. This is Elise's old BlackBerry. Those even exist anymore? I don't know. I've got a compact mirror with a little bit of makeup thing on here. It's bad luck to open an umbrella, isn't it? Inside? Yeah, well, the Lord will protect me. I'm preaching, right? I've got a little motorcycle here. That could represent, you know, a number of different things for us, right? It could represent, it could represent vehicles, car payments, things like that. It could represent jealousy, looking around at people around you and wanting what they have, you know. I've got a rose on here. I looked for a Barbie doll, but I didn't have one of those in my house. Go figure. I have a rose on here to represent relationships. It could represent love. It also could represent the ugly side of desire, okay? We have some kids in here, so I won't get too specific, but I think you all can leap with me on that one, right? We have a rose here. I put a little, this is one of those baseball caps you eat ice cream out of at the ball game, but I put it on here. Maybe something like sports. Maybe it's the things that you enjoy doing, your hobbies, whatever it might be, you know. And then we continue to go around here. I've got on here house keys, okay? Maybe it's the things that you desire, maybe the things that your culture values, things like a house. And we're back around here to the cell phone technology, right? I don't know about you, but you go around anywhere, you can see like people all over Roanoke just walking around with their face in their phone, you know? And maybe it's what they look like online, maybe it's what people are thinking about them. Again, the compact, obviously, you know, this is a very vain thing, right? Checking to make sure you look good, right? Or making sure that you measure up to the appearances that the world has for you. You know, what's funny is that if I was in a relationship with God and I was seeking after God and I was filling my life with the things of God, I wouldn't have all these things in my face. But the moment I start looking around, I don't know, it's impossible, isn't it? In our culture, our day and age, there are so many things that our culture says we ought to be chasing after. You ought to be beautiful, right? You got to make sure you're beautiful. You got to do whatever it takes to be beautiful. Good-looking men, you may not struggle with this, but you may be too far gone too. I don't know. I'm just kidding. But we all struggle with this. We do struggle with our appearance and what people think of us when they look at us, whether it's vain, like, do I look good in these clothes, or whether it's, am I impressive to my coworkers, right? The car, you look at it and you see the person who drives by in the car that's nicer than yours. You say, I think I make more money than them, right? And you're thinking, I'm gonna get a nicer car. Or you look at the relationship that seems really happy and you say, I want to be happy. Am I in a relationship? Or you see the person who is really successful in their hobbies, or maybe parents, you have children who are in athletic leagues that take place on Sunday mornings during church time. All these different things. We've got all this stuff that we tend to focus on in our world. They become our focus, and what happens is the more we focus on them, the less we focus on our relationship with the Lord. You see, this is exactly what Satan wants to do. He's going to dangle these things in front of us. He's going to dangle them so that we get our eyes focused on them and not focus on our relationship with God. And the more that we are focused on the things of this world, the less we are going to be focused on our relationship with God, and the harder it is going to be for us to A, remain close to Him, and B, do His will in this world. I wonder what things are in your life. What is it that you want to seek after and struggle after? Because the truth is that we all have things like this, even your pastor does. We look around and we think, I wish my life was more like theirs. Or I wish I had this like that person had. I love cars. I always want to get a new car. If Felice would let me, I'd go trade in my car right now and go get something new. But the truth is, then I'd have to make car payments, right? And all the things that go along with that. That means my money's going to be tied up in things that are pretty selfish, honestly, when I have a car that works just fine. Maybe it's a house. You really want that security of, I don't know what it is for you. But what happened to the Israelites, what happened to the Hebrew people, is they were focused on their relationship with God. They were seeking after him. They were close to him. But then they started to see the things in their culture around them that seemed attractive. And they focused their eyes on those things instead of God. And the result is that they grew apart from him. Eugene Peterson is the editor of The Message. You might know The Message as a translation of the Bible. And he wrote a book called The Five Smooth Stones for Pastoral Work. And what was really interesting, one of the chapters is all focused on the book of Ezekiel. And he explains it as when you're in a relationship with God, it's like a river. Okay, your relationship with God is like a river. It's deep and it's moving fast, and the water is clear and cool and refreshing. It courses its way through, the desert or wherever it might be, bringing life to everything. But here's what happened in the lives of the Hebrew people during this time. They started to get focused on all this other stuff. It's like they took the things of their culture and threw them into the middle of the river. Do you know that in history that we have great sewer systems and now where everything gets processed? But in history they used to literally just dump sewage into rivers, and garbage that they had, they literally just throw it into rivers. Can you imagine the Roanoke River, just everybody's unmentionable things just going into that river? It's terrible. Growing up, we lived in this small subdivision. There was a trailer, mobile home park right next to it, and there was a hill back there. And the people in this park, they would just throw all their garbage on this hill instead of taking it down to the dumpster that they had down at the bottom of their mobile home park. When you throw stuff away like that, it clutters up, right? And he said in the history of the Hebrew people, it's like they had this clear, crystal, cold, flowing water that represented their relationship with God, and it was great, it was life-giving, but they began to be focused on other things. So it's like they threw things into the middle of the river until the river got stopped up. It widened out, it got warmed up, it got dirty, and it was no longer desirable. He said God called Ezekiel to come and call the people out on their stuff. To say this river has grown stagnant. There's junk in it and it's not flowing right anymore. And so today, this is my challenge for us. Has your relationship with God grown stagnant because you're too focused on the other things around you in this world? Are there things about life, money, home, relationships, technology? I love getting new phones. I don't know about you, but it's like I'm a kid on Christmas when I get a new phone, right? It's so fun. As those kinds of things, those focuses, maybe it's your children, your relationships, maybe it's sports. I don't know what it is, but there's things in our lives that could even be bad things in your life. You're focused on your health that's been poor, or you're focused on the fact that you don't have enough money. You're focused on all these other things that it's like you've been throwing all these things into the river that is your relationship with God until that river has grown stagnant. It's grown shallow. It's not crystal clear. It's not pure anymore. It's all messed up. When I was a kid, we visited Yellowstone National Park. Anybody ever been to Yellowstone before? It's beautiful. It's amazing. It's a long way from here, so good luck if you're going to drive there. But it's a wonderful place. We got to visit Old Faithful, the geyser. Now, anybody know much about Old Faithful? They call it Old Faithful because I think, and I could be wrong on the timing, but it's supposed to erupt with, 75 foot or whatever it is high water just gushing out of the earth like every hour. And it's Old Faithful because it happened on the hour, like every hour. And when we went, you were only allowed to get within like 150 feet of it. But I read this plaque. Those they put the big plaques of wood right there and you can read all the stuff about it. It said on there, you used to be able to walk right up to the edge of the geyser. People used to go up there and they would camp out. They would put up tents and get their charcoal grills out and all this stuff. That'd be fun, wouldn't it? They would sometimes bring even couches and things like that with them. Sit on the side. said Old Faithful does no longer goes off on the hour every hour. It used to. It stopped going off every hour on the hour because people kept taking stuff and throwing it in to the geyser. They were hoping they'd get to see, I don't know, like a whole couch go up in the air. That'd be pretty cool, but it didn't happen. It just got stuck. He said this is so bad. There's been so many things that scientists have tried to remove from this, but they can't. And so it's messed up the flow. It's messed up the timeliness. It's messed up how it was created to be. And this is what happens in our relationship with the Lord, is that when we focus on other things, it's like a river that we keep throwing junk in. It's not going to be clean. It's not going to be good. It's not going to be pure. It's not going to be right anymore because we're focused on all the other stuff. It's like Old Faithful that went off on the hour every hour, but people kept throwing junk into it, and eventually it stopped going off every hour on the hour. And it's still beautiful and it's still great. It's still God's creation, but it's not how it's supposed to be. And that's what our soul is like. God created us to be close to him. He created us so that we would draw close to him. He created us so that we'd be in relationship with him. But when we have other stuff, other junk in our lives, it prevents us from being close to God. First off, it makes our water, it makes our lives, it makes our souls impure, okay? It means that we are not as close to God as we need to be, and we need to check our souls on that. But the second thing is this: it doesn't allow us to do the things which God created us in order to do. Ephesians chapter 2 says this, that God prepared good works in advance for us to do. He has something set out for you. He has you on this earth for a purpose. He wants you to do something great for his kingdom. Your purpose is not just to get a good career and work really hard, okay? That's one of those, I wish I could have hung a whole career from that thing, but it'd be a little too heavy. Your purpose on this earth is not to get a new phone every 2 years. Your purpose on this earth is not to look the coolest in a new car or even to get a house. Your purpose on this earth, guess what? It's not even just to raise kids. Your purpose on this earth is to give glory to God and raise his name higher so that others might come to do the same. We talked about this a couple of months ago, didn't we? We talked about how people, what's our vision as a church? What's our plan? Why does God have us on this earth? God's purpose of having us on this earth is so that we can love him, love others, and help others love him. But if we allow all this other junk to stop up our geyser, to stop up our river, then we're not going to be as close to him as we could be. So here's my challenge to you, church. We're gonna pray and we're gonna sing a song. We're gonna dismiss. My challenge to you is this: to sit in the weight of what we talked about today. Let me explain what that means. To sit here and think about this. What are those things in your life that God might be asking you to cut off so that you might be closer to him? I'm not trying to make you feel guilty today, church, but I am asking the Holy Spirit for his conviction in our lives. That if there are things in our hearts, in our souls, the things that we chase after in this world that are of the culture, that are of our world, that are not of him, that he would point those out so clearly to us that we might then go forth as changed people because we've given them over to him. So that's how I want to close today. I'm going to say a word of prayer, and you're welcome to come to the altar if you'd like, but you can do that right from your seat. If there's something in your life that maybe is separating you from God, or maybe is making it so your river is not as clean and crystal clear and pure and fast flowing as it should be, if there's something that you've allowed to creep in, whether it's one of the things that was on this umbrella, the $20 bill or whatever, or your own thing, I want to ask you to pray and ask the Lord to release you from that thing. But this might mean there are some changes that you need to make in your life. There might be a person that you love, but you need to think about your relationship with them. There might be something that you really desire, but you might need to think about the cost of it and whether it's worth it. There might be something that is really good and good for your family or whatever, but it's not what God wants for you. There may be something that you're so angry about towards God that it's prevented you from being as close to him as you could be. Let me tell you this, that God has created you for a purpose. And until you cut those things off in your life, you're not going to be able to live fully in that purpose that he has for you. The second thing is this, that he wants to be close to you, and he can't be if your life and your heart is full of other stuff. Would you pray with me, church? Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for the opportunity to be here in your house, God. I pray I pray, Lord, that you would convict our hearts, convict our spirits. That we wouldn't feel guilty. Guilt does not come from you, but conviction comes from you. So if there's something in my life, Lord, that needs to be cut off so that I can be closer to you, I pray that you'd make it so painfully clear to me that I can't go on living another day. And the same thing is true for the people who are here with me today. If there's something in their life that is preventing them from being close to you, maybe it's a sin, maybe it's a desire, maybe it's something that they look around and they want that somebody else has, I pray, God, that you would make it so clear to them that they need to just cut that off so that you can move fully in their lives. Lord, you called your prophet Ezekiel to be a watchman. A watchman goes out, a watchman calls out those things that are wrong and says, watch out. And so today, Lord, you're speaking to our hearts. You're speaking to this pastor. You're speaking to this congregation. And there's some things in our life, Lord, that you're saying, watch out. That's too important to you. And I pray, God, that we'd give those things over to you today. We love you, Lord.